So I think we're going to get started again into our third of four sessions for today. So in case anyone is new here for this session, I know we've had some people join, so I'm not sure if any of we have new people that weren't in the two sessions this morning. I'm just going to go over the same one slide of logistics just to cover the basis. So again, this session is being recorded and all attendees have their cameras and microphones turned off. We will be posting all of the recordings from every session on our YouTube channel afterwards as well. You do have meeting controls in this meeting. We do have a sample of what that ribbon looks like on our screen. It might look different depending on what device you're viewing on, but you do have a button to open the chat, to raise and lower your hand, to do reactions, and to change your screen view. If you have a question as we go along today, feel free to put that in the chat and we can answer them. And then at the end, if there is time, we'll be able to take questions verbally by using the raise hand feature as well. And then finally, if you do have any technical issues throughout this session, you can either put them in the chat if you're in the meeting, or you can also email planning@livefree.nh.gov, where we have someone monitoring that to help as well. So we'll move right into the session. So our next session is called Alternative Overlay Districts, which will be presented by Mark Connors, who is the planner in the town of Stratham. And then we also have Roger LaRochelle, Executive Director of the Squam Lakes Conservation Society. And with that, I will pass it over to Mark to begin.
Great, thanks, Katie. So my name is Mark Connors, as Katie mentioned, and I'm the town planner in Stratham. Stratham is on the seacoast. You're not familiar with it. It's a town of about 7,500 people, located between Exeter and Portsmouth. And this corridor we're going to be talking about today, it's the Route 33 corridor. It stretches from the Stratham traffic circle to the Greenland town line. And this was originally Route 101. So before the highway was completed to Hampton, this was kind of the main east-west highway in the seacoast area, linking points west to the Portsmouth area. So this corridor, as I mentioned, it stretches from the town circle to the Greenland town line, and it's primarily a residential corridor. It was, when this initiative started, it was zoned completely residential. It includes the Stratham Hill Park, if you're familiar with that, which is kind of right in the center of the district. And includes a lot of the historic buildings from Stratham's past. It also, I should mention, because it's a fairly well-traveled highway, there had previously been talk in town about making this a commercially zoned corridor. So it even advanced to a vote, and the town voted against that. But one problem the town was realizing we were having was that we're getting zoning variance applications for commercial uses along the corridor, which are often being approved. If you're familiar with that process, when a variance is basically an exception from the zoning. So when you have something like that approved, it takes a lot of the control out of the town's hands. So that was one of the challenges we faced in this corridor. As I mentioned, this is a really historic part of Stratham. This was originally known as the King's Great Highway. It started in the late 17th century, linking Portsmouth and Exeter. It used to even have a streetcar line that went down the center of this road. People could take that to get to Stratham Hill Park or get to Exeter or Portsmouth. And it's always served as kind of the town's primary business and civic corridor. And there are about, in this stretch that we're speaking of, Portsmouth Avenue, there are about 36 historically significant buildings. But they're sprinkled in with newer buildings. It doesn't, if you were to drive the corridor, you wouldn't necessarily recognize it as being, it doesn't jump out like an Amherst Village or something like that, because it certainly has evolved over the years. But a lot of historic kind of heritage buildings intermixed in the corridor. So in 2019, this town completed its master plan. And this corridor really emerged as one of the major themes of the master plan. The town really wanted to take a harder look at the corridor, the future of the corridor, land uses, and particularly preserving historic buildings along the corridor. So as a direct result of the master plan, the town started a committee of people representing different committees in town, the Heritage Commission, the Planning Board, but primarily the folks that live or own businesses along the corridor. And that took off in 2020, which was right in the middle of the pandemic. But this was a great kind of volunteer effort that happened. I'm not sure how engaged the town was, kind of greater community was engaged with this effort, just because this was kind of during the height of the pandemic and there were a lot of distractions. So the town at the end of 2020 kind of wrestled with the idea of taking, some folks have done some work on a zoning amendment, and they wrestled the idea of taking that for a vote in 2021. But they decided not to do that just because there hadn't been the public process they'd like there to be, just because that was challenging due to the pandemic. And the town adopted, before the Heritage District, the town adopted some other tools to encourage historic preservation. So the town has adopted RSA 79E and D, which provides for tax breaks so long as the historic building is preserved. So here are some images from some of the buildings, some of the historic buildings along the corridor. Stratham is historically a kind of farming community, so the town kind of grew out of the Revolutionary War era. We had about 1,000 people then, and Stratham was one of those towns where we had about 1,000 people in the late 1700s and 1,000 people in the mid 1900s. There was not a lot of change in Stratham for a long period of time. And then in the 1950s, 60s, as kind of the Portsmouth area grew, Stratham kind of became a popular bedroom community. So the town really experienced a lot of growth in the later part of the 19th century. But prior to that, it had been very stable, almost stagnant in terms of population prior to that. Let's see here. So this building is kind of an example, one of the reasons the town wanted to pursue the Heritage District. This is a property that's on the National Register of Historic Places. It has a main residence, which is fortunately in much better shape than this barn that you're seeing, which unfortunately, due to the owners not being able to maintain the property, has fallen into such a state of disrepair that really it's not salvageable at this point. And so there's a lot of properties like this along the corridor. As I mentioned, it's a farming community, so there'd be these big barns, kind of larger homes. It's a lot of property to maintain, and the town realized it was expensive for folks to kind of keep these properties in good conditions. We wanted to expand the tools available to people to be able to invest in properties. So these are some of the objectives that grew out of that volunteer-led effort I mentioned back in 2019. The town is really looking at chiefly to preserve the historic buildings along the corridor, to promote adaptive reuse of historic buildings, certainly to discourage demolitions. We didn't want a really top-down regulatory approach. We wanted flexibility to allow creativity for property owners. So we wanted this to be as kind of collaborative and flexible as possible. And we wanted to encourage more private investment along the corridor, because as I was seeing, unfortunately, we're seeing some properties that are falling into disrepair. We wanted to encourage good design. And I spoke about that zoning variance process that kind of takes the framework outside the town's hands. We wanted to avoid those situations. We wanted to create a process that almost every application would go through this process. The town had a stronger role in review. So I started with the town in early 2021. That was when that committee process had wound down. The town had decided not to take an amendment to the town that year. And they weren't exactly sure what route they wanted to go. They had done a great job of kind of identifying the issues and the challenges, but wasn't quite sure what tool we should adopt to kind of bring forward the town's vision. And so we looked at some different options. And I remember reading about neighborhood heritage districts, the state Division of Historical Resources many years back, I think 2008, published a guidebook about neighborhood heritage districts in New Hampshire. And I remember reading about this, and that kind of caught my eye as a tool that might be good for Stratham, because prior to this, the town had thought about enacting a site plan review process specific to this district. The problem is in that New Hampshire, single-family homes and duplexes don't go through site plan review. So there's no kind of involvement in the design from the town's perspective for site plans, for projects that are not site plans. So we really wanted to capture, because the dominant use along the corridor is single family homes, farms, things like that. We wanted to capture those properties. So if there was a proposal to demolish a historic residential building, we wanted the town to have a say in that process. And there was some discussion about a historic district. But as I mentioned, this corridor is not going to jump out as a historic district because there's been a lot of development, a lot of historic building, but there's been a lot of development in between. So we want to preserve those historic buildings. We want to kind of preserve the character of the corridor, but it wasn't necessarily so unique that it necessarily needed a historic district designation. So we felt this was somewhat similar in that it gave the town more of a seat in terms of regulating applications. And the biggest one was to have a say in demolitions. If a residential building that was historic in nature was going to be demolished, the town wanted the ability to regulate that. So to potentially say, no, you can't do this, or no, you can only do this if you do this and this. So that's one of the reasons that a heritage district really jumped out at us as a potential tool. It involves an advisory committee process that reviews applications. They provide input to the planning board, and the planning board makes a final decision. And there's not under state law, there's not a specific RSA that relates to heritage districts. This is enabled under RSA 674-21, Innovative Land Use Controls. So in spring of 2021, we really realized that we felt this was the direction we wanted to go. We spoke to the Heritage Commission, the Planning Board, and we found there was some support. So we actually had community input sessions in May of 2021. So that was before we'd written anything, before we finalized anything. The reason we decided to host a public input session at that time, because we just wanted to run the idea by the community and get some buy-in before we went through the time to kind of write the zoning language. So we had that public input session in May. This was, again, during the pandemic. Not quite the peak of it, but it did make public input a little more challenging. So we hosted events that we kind of advertised it as participate in your pajamas type of event. So you could participate over Zoom from your own homes if you wanted. You could also come to town hall. You could socially distance and participate in these input sessions. And there were two different times during the evening, and we had one on a Saturday morning to try to maximize participation. And we sent a letter to every property owner in the district encouraging folks to participate. So after we had that event, that went well. We found there was support among the property owners. They were to tout what we thought were some of the benefits, which, as I mentioned, the main kind of thing the town was looking for was to preserve the historic characters, to have some say in demolition requests or any kind of major request where there's going to be major design changes to a historic building. And we thought it was a more collaborative, design-focused review process that might be allowed under a typical kind of historic district designation. And we felt it maintained flexibility for property owners. And so I spoke a little bit about the process, but just again, this is how we've set it up in Stratum. There's a property owner always has the ability to meet with the committee if they want, kind of on a casual basis, just to kind of run an idea by them. But they also complete an application instead. This processed by the planning department. Town sets up a meeting of this advisory committee within 2 weeks where they're given feedback on their proposal. And they have an opportunity to revise their application based on that feedback. And then it goes to the planning board, which makes a kind of yes or no decision, or the planning board also has the ability to approve a project with conditions. And this is an example of a project in Stratum. This was actually something that predated the Heritage District, but it was something that required a zoning variance. So this was a gentleman who was investing in an old historic property and making it an antique shop. The barn is the antique shop. But I had to go through the zoning variance process, and the town didn't want that. This is the kind of project that we really wanted to encourage along the corridor. So when we were going through the zoning, we wanted to make the uses more flexible, so you could have small shops, small cafes, things like that. That wouldn't still maintain the character of the district, but provide the property owner more flexibility in terms of renovating these older historic buildings. So the way the process has been set up in Stratum is there are projects that require review and there's projects that don't require review, so that you can just go and apply for a building permit just as you normally would without having to go through an extra process. So projects that don't require a review by the town are basic kind of maintenance projects. If you're replacing doors and windows, if it's of a similar type that are on the property, you don't need to go through the process. If you're painting your house, you're replacing the siding with a similar siding material, you don't need to go through the process. If you're making landscape changes, or you're adding a small shed or greenhouse, or even an addition that you can't see from the right of way, those are all types of projects that we wouldn't require this review process. Obviously, anything inside the home we would not review as well. But the types of projects we did want to have a look at, those were any demolitions, any kind of major building additions or new accessory buildings. If you're removing stone walls or large trees along the right-of-way, the town wanted to review those changes. And if you're making a major change in terms of building materials, we also wanted to have a say in those types of projects. So really what we're trying to do is strike a balance between providing property owners a great deal more flexibility, but also kind of balancing that with more regulatory control over major design changes and demolitions, as I mentioned. So that was sort of we're trying to strike this balance when we were writing this zoning to kind of meet both of those objectives. And we were taking this to the town. If you've been to Stratum, Stratum has a kind of traditional commercial corridor along Portsmouth Avenue, right off of Route 101. So this is the 108 section of Portsmouth Avenue. And it's not a very kind of visually attractive commercial corridor. It's a very kind of typical commercial corridor with a lot of what you might call commercial sprawl. And so we're taking this to the town, particularly the property owners along the corridor. We really had to emphasize that this was not something we were looking to do along the 33 corridor. Stratum really lacks a small business, kind of town-centered business community. And so we thought that Route 33 corridor would be good for those types of businesses. But we really wrote the zoning to prohibit or at least strongly deter this type of development. So there's limits on the size of commercial uses in the corridor. There's limits on parking and signage and a lot of architectural requirements. So we were really emphasizing that Stratum already has this. We don't want this along the 33 corridor. We designed the zoning specifically to kind of discourage this kind of development. So what were we looking for? We had to really, I think, present to the property owners and the town as a whole what the town's vision for the 33 corridor was. And so as I mentioned, this is a residentially zoned corridor. We wanted whatever took place here in the future to respect that. So whatever uses popped up along 33, they could kind of live peacefully in coexistence alongside folks that are just residing along the corridor. So, sleeping and taking naps and working from home, those types of activities wouldn't be interrupted by anything you'd see in the future along the corridor. But we did also want to provide a place, as I mentioned, we don't really have Stratum doesn't have a downtown or a particularly large village centers. We wanted to create more opportunities for places where people might meet in town in a small business setting. So it's a picture of a cafe or a shared workspace or some more green areas where people can get together. Lots of folks who are very artistic in the towns. We wanted places where people could get together for artistic events, performances. There's a use in the town next to us, the Word Barn in Exeter. And so that type of a use where there's kind of poetry jams and small bands We didn't want to discourage that when we're writing zoning for the corridor. As I mentioned, there's a lot of farms along the corridor, so we wanted to create places for people to have a bite to eat in kind of a small cafe setting, sort of a farm to table type concept. We weren't looking for chain stores or drive-throughs or anything like that. And the zoning has been written to prohibit those kind of larger scale uses. A lot of folks who do work from home, even some kind of small manufacturing, so we want to not discourage that. We want to provide an opportunity for like a maker space or woodworking shop or similar types of small manufacturing uses that can kind of coexist in a mostly residential neighborhood. And these are kind of examples of historic buildings that have been reutilized for different purposes in New Hampshire, all outside of Stratham. But these were some of the projects we're trying to show the town. This is really our vision. So the building on the left is a bed and breakfast, I believe, in Wolfboro. The next image is a coffee shop in Bedford. It's an old house that's been converted along Route 101. The third is a barn that's a farm-to-table restaurant in Wilton. And the last one is a winery just up the road from us in Newfields. That obviously a historic house that's been converted into a winery. So these are the types of projects we're trying to advertise the vision for the corridor, that we're trying to show people this is what we're tailoring the zoning to do. And this is what we're trying to encourage along the corridor. So when it came down to the nuts and bolts of what uses we would allow along the corridor and what we would allow by conditional use permit, and those we would prohibit, uses that were allowed by right are obviously all kind of major residential uses, but also bed and breakfast, agriculture, churches, daycare facilities, educational facilities. So those small community art centers are all made permitted uses. And then a lot of uses that are permitted by conditional use permit. And these all have limits on them. So pretty much any commercial use is limited to 2,500 square feet. So if you have a retail shop, it has to be relatively small. And also do a small restaurant or a brewery or winery, a small event venue, light manufacturing, maker spaces. We allow banks, we don't allow drive-throughs. So these types of uses were allowed by conditional use permit when the zoning was written. And just take you through the timeline a little bit. This was really identified as a major issue in 2019 during the town's master plan process. There was that during 2020, during the height of the pandemic, there was this volunteer committee that met and did a great job of kind of outlining what the challenges were, what the goals of the town were. And then in 2021 is really, I would say this was, in terms of writing the zoning or kind of thinking about it and kind of workshopping it, it was about a 15-month process from January 2021 until the zoning was adopted in 2022. So just to take you a little bit through that process, it was very important to the town that this be a public process, that the owners of property in the district had plenty of opportunities to get their input in. So before we did anything back in April, we just kind of identified a heritage district as a tool we wanted to support. We were thinking about, we thought would be a good tool for Stratham. We sent a letter to all the property owners at that period, let them know this is what the town was thinking about doing. We really wanted their input before we dedicated any significant amount of time to this. We wanted them to kind of put their 2 cents in. So we did host those public input sessions back in May of 2021. And those were in person as well as over Zoom. We had great feedback based on those sessions. So that's when we kind of did the major work of putting the zoning together. And that was mostly written by October of 2021. At that time, we developed a website and we held workshops jointly between the Planning Board and the Heritage Commission. And we sent a second letter to property owners letting them know that we had written the zoning. It's available for them to review online. And this is all kind of, this whole project was a very kind of mid-pandemic type exercise. So in January, when we were really pushing the public hearings for the zoning. I think it was a flare up in COVID. So we couldn't do major kind of in-person events. We decided, what I thought was a good kind of middle ground was I went and I basically took my laptop and went to work in the library. So we let property owners know that I'd be there the whole week. They had questions, they could come chat with me in the library, kind of one-on-one, which I think was a great suggestion because a lot of people are more comfortable talking one-on-one as opposed to in a major public input session. So I hold those events in January. There are some minor tweaks made in January, but the planning board was very comfortable with the language by then. So they moved it forward to the town ballot, and it passed in March 2022. Really overwhelmingly, it was definitely not the most controversial item on the ballot that year, which was surprising to us because it was a major change. But it passed with 80% support. So it took us about 90 days after March to get the kind of applications together, get the committee formed. So June of 2022 really started accepting applications. So it hasn't been quite a full year yet, but there's been approximately 5 applications that have gone through the process. And we think the district is doing what it was designed to do. And really what we're focusing now is trying to get the word out. So encourage people in the district to, they have ideas for projects, to come talk to us. We just sent out a letter to property owners, letting them know, kind of reminding them this tool is in place, and encouraging them to come speak to us if they have ideas for projects. And to our knowledge, based on what the state told us, we're the first town in the state to adopt a heritage district. So if you have questions about that, how the process has gone, happy to answer them. But when I think about New Hampshire, I'm from Milford, which has kind of a historic town center, but it's not a lot of changes made over the years. So that's kind of a lot of historic buildings, but a lot of changes as well. In my opinion, town centers like Milford, you see across the state, would be good candidates for this type of tool because it gives the town more control over design and demolitions, which is, I think, an important point, not just in Stratham, but in other communities across the state.
So Mark, we do have a couple questions in the chat, so I don't know if you want to just answer them real quickly since we still have 45 minutes left and we can get into Roger's presentation as well. So
Sure.
The first question is the Heritage Commission and or Historic District Commission involved at all in this process, or is it just strictly Planning Board?
So there was it's kind of a separate committee that was created just for this district. So that's the Route 33 Heritage District Commission or Committee. And it's a small committee because we have a lot of committees in Stratham. We didn't want to create, a huge new separate kind of review process. We deliberately made it small to keep it easier to organize. So it's 3 members appointed by the Heritage Commission. There's 1 member appointed by the Planning Board and 1 member appointed by the Select Board. So they review the applications. Then it's the Planning Board, though, that has the regulatory authority. So we looked at allowing the committee to be able to approve applications, but under that innovative land use control legislation, it has to be the Planning Board to approve the application. So that's how we wrote the zoning.
Okay. And then the follow-up question to that was, how would this work if a town doesn't have a town planner? So I guess it's more, do you have any recommendations of how a town could approach this if they don't have a full-time or even, I guess, a part-time town planner position?
It could certainly be done in towns that don't have a planner. So, my main role for Stratham was to help organize, obviously, the public input. And I wrote at least the first draft of the zoning, which then went through these major reviews by the town. But if you have volunteers that are kind of dedicated and can write the zoning, or you have a regional planning commission that can help you write the zoning, that's kind of the biggest barrier is getting that. It's about 10 pages of text and a lot of different things to think about. So that was what we spent the most time doing, probably from a staff perspective. But it's definitely something you could do if you don't have a planner, because you have a planning board. So where people are dropping off applications with the planning board, this is where they could drop off applications for a heritage district if you decide to adopt one.
Okay. And there's just one more question that I'll ask you now, and then we'll save anything else that comes in for at the end. But the question was, has the Neighborhood Heritage District, since its creation in March of 22, dealt with any demo permits? If so, what has the pattern of decisions on those?
It's a good question. So that picture I showed of the barn that was falling in on itself, that building was finally condemned by the fire chief. So that was the first application to this review process, which was interestingly one of the major reasons the town started this process. So it was interesting that the town had sent letters, the Heritage Commission had sent letters to the property owner, kind of letting him know different tools are available, and we never heard back from him. But when we created this process, the owners had to go submit an application and appear before the planning board. It was great to finally meet the property owners, to kind of hear about what some of their struggles were in maintaining the property, just develop kind of a relationship with them, because as I mentioned, this is it's on the National Historic Register. It's one of the oldest buildings along the corridor. So that was the first building that went through. And if you saw that picture, obviously this process started too late to save that building, but we were able to talk to the owners about the house that's in much better shape, but it's also not in the best shape. So we were able to recommend some tools available to them for the house to maintain that in better shape. So that's been the only demolition application I think we've had so far.
Great. I think that's all I see somebody raise their hand, but I'm going to save the raised hand questions for the end of the session. So feel free to leave your hand raised for the remainder of the session, and we'll get to that at the end. But I guess now we will turn it over to Roger if you want to take control.
Okay. Can you hear me first, Katie?
Yes, I can hear you. You sound crystal clear.
All right, terrific. Oh, I guess my camera's not on. I don't know if it's supposed to be. But hello, my name is Roger LaRochelle, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Squam Lakes Conservation Society. Thanks for taking the time this afternoon in considering alternative districts. We're going to go on a journey on a even more alternative district than one that is conducted, as Mark just explained, through the public process. I'm going to take you on a journey to Squam Lake and the Squam watershed and talk about an effort from a group of citizens, community members that got together with a consultant to create a district listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So I'm going to start with slides. Okay, so the Conservation Society's mission is to preserve the unique quality and character of the Squam watershed, and in our case, by protecting lands for present and future generations. One of the realizations in considering the cultural landscape is how complementary the cultural landscape is to the physical landscape. So just a quick word about the Conservation Society. We're the first of the local land trust in New Hampshire. We have about 700 member households. We protect 173 properties. The Squam watershed is 30% permanently protected. And what's notable about that is virtually all of that land is privately owned. There are no state parks, there's no national holdings. To the north of us is the White Mountain National Forest. And the municipalities hold very little land. So it was done through private citizens protecting land. And the majority of those projects were donated, which some think of Squam as a well-heeled community, but it's really a community defined by its conservation ethic. So there's certainly something about Squam. It is the second largest lake entirely in New Hampshire. Umbagog is a little bigger than Squam, but lies between Maine and New Hampshire. I'll show you a map momentarily on how Squam and Ashland is the geographic center of New Hampshire. There are over 50 miles of hiking trails, but again, it's a community defined by its conservation ethos. And and also its natural resources. So Squam, as I said, is at the geographic center. If you could cut out New Hampshire and put it on a pin, Squam would lie right in the middle. But what's most interesting is it lies at the intersection of three major ecoregions. There's the peneplain going out towards the coast. There's the northern forest to the north, and the Connecticut River, New England's largest river, to the west. And those three ecoregions intersect at Squam. As I said, there's a very strong conservation ethos and a very strong sense of place. I cannot tell you how many license plates I've seen with variations on Squam from all over the country. There was a book published some time ago by Rachel Carley in 2004, simply entitled Squam, which for me really captured both the place and the character of the community. It's not just about a place, it's really about an integrated community. So one of the notable aspects of Squam, it is the birthplace of youth camps in this country, and one of our best exports that I feel that America has done is to export the youth camps and their role in educating our youth. So in 1881 on Church Island, the very first youth camp was born, and it begat a series of other camps that then spread throughout New England and New York, and to this day is an important feature in New Hampshire. Groton School Camp was 1893, one of the first charity programs in the state. So what Squam is noted for is its recreational opportunities, not only for enjoying the outdoors, but as a summer resort, people would come up by rail to Ashland, and they would get on a cart and head over to the lake, where there was a ferry service bringing them to various destinations. So people came, writers, ministers, musicians. On Shepherd Hill was quite a colony of intellectual. Margaret Mead spent some time there, Lauren Frank, and others. And there were several large hotels that are no longer extant. Asquam House sat at the top of Shepherd Hill, and in 1946 was eventually torn down, and most of the others either burned down or were torn down. But just a note about the real estate market conditions at Squam. There's very little speculative housing. There's very, very few sales. On a given year, there might be 10 to 20 properties around the lakes. There are 8 lakes that define the Squam watershed. And the land value is proportionally high. So the majority of the value lies in the underlying land and not necessarily in the developed properties, which is different than, Newfound, Sunapee, Winnisquam, Winnipesaukee. And our mantra is conserve what you love. So I'm going to show some of the cultural features around the lake, which kind of spurred this thought of how to preserve the cultural landscape in addition to the physical landscape. So Burley Bray was part of the Webster family manse. Webster started Stone and Webster Engineering in Boston. They had a large place, but there were several other smaller places, various ministers, Shepherd Hill, which is where that Asquam Hotel was. A series of farms. This was the True Farm, which was around 1800, and a series of buildings were added to over time. A number of other agricultural land. So in 1840 or so, Sandwich was one of the 10 largest towns in New Hampshire. There was a lot of pasture land, and it reached its peak by 1860. And then once more fertile lands were discovered out west, people headed out, which then ushered in another phase. So summer camps became the prevailing cultural feature after the agricultural period in the 1800s. So Rocky Wool Deep Haven camps, some of you may be familiar with. It's still very much in operation, and it is host to people from throughout the East during the summertime. And the Chocorua Island Chapel, this was once the Camp Chocorua, the first camp in the country, no longer was extant. It then later yielded to a chapel, and Chocorua Island Chapel is still going to this day. So every Sunday during the summer, there's a service there. So here's an image around the lake. This is focused on lakeside properties. There are still 72 pre-1920 camps around the community. And this is such a defining characteristic of the Squam community. So the question is how can you work to unify the community in preserving some of these cultural features? So again, a group of citizens in 2009 got together and started asking questions. They raised a little bit of money, and the goal was to protect the cultural heritage of the watershed by recognizing its cultural features, the barns, the camps, and various historic features. And the idea was to keep all of these stories, all of the history alive. So over time, 17 different properties have been listed on the National Register, which includes about over 275 resources and 1,200 acres. So when Mark was showing slides, and Liz Hengen was the consultant in working on creating heritage sites. So Liz also worked as the program consultant on this effort. So on the left side, you can see the evolution and preservation of a lakeside community, which was a multiple property listing on the National Register. This was groundbreaking at the time. It's the first watershed that we knew of in New England, perhaps the country, in which 40,000 acres was put on the National Register through this multiple property listing, which then provides a gateway to put individual properties on the National Register. So the essence of that, and this is where the district part of it comes in, is this multiple property listing created a larger district, and it allowed us to keep telling the story of its cultural resources in addition to the natural resources. And then since then, 17 various projects with multiple buildings were put on the National Register. So the intent here was to have an archive, and again, keeping these stories alive. And the research that's done on each of these National Register properties is extensive and really valued by the homeowners, the landowners, because it continues to tell the story. And really what we're trying to do is to have a complement to low impact uses using the historical resources. So there's an image of outlined in red. It doesn't exactly mirror the watershed, but it's more or less around the watershed, which captured all of the various former agricultural properties, historic camps, private camps, family-owned camps, as well as camp properties. Derek Brereton was an anthropologist, and he wrote a book called Kinship and Landscape at Squam Lake. And one of his quotes was, "The type of experiences which old camps avail their indwellers are instrumental in the camp's own preservation and bequeathal." A lot of words, but the essence of that is that all of our properties have stories, whether they're new or older. Older ones obviously have rich stories. And the idea was to keep these stories alive. And these old camps that are on highly valued property on Swan Lake, the buildings themselves are not worth very much, but they are the place where, grandfather, was there, and grandma brought books, and it's a place to continue to tell family stories. So one of the things that this begat from a land conservation perspective are campstead easements. So campstead easements are a particular kind of brand of conservation easements in which we include the building in the conservation area. So generally speaking, land trusts such as the Conservation Society focus on land, and we run away from buildings. We don't want anything to do with them. Historic preservation is all about the building. What we set out to do with these campstead easements is to include the building as a feature in the landscape, and to identify the significance of the cultural aspects as well as the physical conservation values that are central to a conservation easement. So we include the building in the restrictions. The difference between a campstead easement and a preservation easement is we're not trying to preserve the actual structure. We're trying to preserve the way that that structure appears on the face of the earth. So that building can be replaced. We don't govern any of the functions inside the building, whether there's a dishwasher, it's insulated or not. What we're trying to do is just to maintain, preserve the character of the landscape, including the building on those particular parcels. So we've done 6 of these campstead easements. These are voluntary agreements. They were donated by the families that just wanted to maintain the character of their property, and they have a willing partner with us in preserving. So couple of features is the ownership, remains with the landowner. It obviously has to be granted to a qualified organization. They are permanent. They run with the land. So our role in going forward is to ensure that the restrictions as defined are carried forward for all the days that come, which is a rather audacious concept. Public access is not mandatory. If people want to open up their homes, great, but there's no obligation. And again, the building may be replaced in like kind, and there are no restrictions governing the interior of the building. There are typically provisions for some allowance, 10%, if a room needed to be added to, and so forth. We do document the fenestration of the building, the doors, and again, what we're trying to maintain is the character of the property and the landscaping. So just a note, from our perspective as a land trust, forever is a long time, as Woody Allen said, especially at the end. We have to be prepared to uphold those restrictions. So we are always concerned about legal defense. So we carry insurance on each property that we conserve, which gives us $500,000 worth of coverage per property. And we take our stewardship very responsibility. We have to monitor annually, and we have to obviously keep very careful records in going forward. So the creation of this district really is a complement to our land conservation. So the Conservation Society acted as a fiscal agent, but it really existed outside of our purview through this group of community members that again were dedicated to trying to maintain and preserve the character of the community. It did involve all the historic districts and various representatives from the community. So again, this was done through private means. It's probably not apropos for every community, but it's an example of what can happen when people band together. So those are, that's the overview, and we can now turn it over to questions. And
So we do Yeah, we do have one question for you, Roger, that was put in the chat. It was, can you give us an example of a qualified organization for the Campstead easements?
Yes. So any land trust would be a qualified organization. Most land trusts, again, shy away from buildings, but I think several lake communities are served by various land trusts, and it would be an opportunity to work with them, and we're glad to serve as an example.
Great, thank you. We still have plenty of time, so if anybody else has any questions, feel free to either raise your hand and I can allow you to unmute yourself and we can take questions verbally, or you can also put any questions in the chat for either Mark or Roger from both presentations. We're happy to take that at this point. I know we had one hand up earlier. Yes, we have it again. Okay. Okay, Tony, I just allowed you to, you have to unmute yourself, but you should be able now to have that option to ask your question.
Yes. So my question would be for Mark. So very interested in the idea of the Heritage District concept because, so just to give you some background, so I live in Hooksett, and Kathy Northrup was the previous chairwoman of our Heritage Commission in Hooksett. I don't know if any of you know her, but she, a while back, had tried to put together a Heritage District for the village area in Hooksett. And from what I'm told and from what I hear, a lot of people in the village area were not in favor of the idea of a historic district because they of all the restrictions and all these things that they couldn't do, and they didn't really like the idea of somebody or government per se telling them what to do with their property. So that's where I don't believe she looked into a neighborhood heritage district. So that's kind of a more appealing approach, and I am definitely interested in trying to approach that for the village area in Hooksett. It seems like for you, Mark, and Stratum, because you're the town planner, right?
Yes.
So we just our town planner just resigned. So we're looking for a new planner. I don't know if we found anybody yet, but so I guess my question would be, to even start that process, it would probably be smart to have the new town planner get involved with that, right?
It can sort of help you kind of in writing the draft language and in sort of organizing the public input sessions, but it's not absolutely necessary. You could always talk to your regional planning commission if you felt like you needed support or wanted to do it immediately. But yeah, obviously it helps to have someone kind of staffing the office, but it's not absolutely necessary.
Okay. Another question would be, so for the heritage, so I guess I'm a little bit confused as far as with the heritage district, is that basically an overlay zone inside the current zoning, or would it be rezoned completely as this heritage district?
So you could do either one. So in Stratum, we decided, because we're changing the uses a lot, so we're basically making a residential area and we're making it more flexible so you could do some commercial uses. We thought it was just easier to change the zone. So Stratum was a rezoning, but you could accomplish the same things as an overlay district. I just think, personally, I tend to shy away from them just because it can get confusing for property owners sometimes if they have sometimes you get multiple overlay districts. So it's easier just to tell people, well, you're in this district and here's the requirements. But you can do either way.
Gotcha. So, for the rezoning process, because it's funny how, like, what you're exactly talking about for Stratum is exactly the same situation we have in the village in Hooksett. Of it's all residential,
Mhm.
all residential homes. There's no commercial. There's Roby's Country Store is the only commercial property in the village.
Mhm.
And so basically what we'd like to do is we'd like to have more business and mixed use on the street level of these residential properties on Main Street. So bringing that commercial aspect, what, like you're talking like cafes or a barbershop or a butcher,
Mhm.
smaller scale type business, because we don't have a downtown very similar to what you're talking about in Stratham. So we want to do that. So I guess probably the best way to go about that would be working with the planning board, because they're the ones that would be rezoning the district, correct?
There'd have to be some kind of zoning amendment. So you'd want to talk to the planning board because they would advance that zoning amendment for you.
Okay.
But the nice thing about a heritage district is you can write the language however you want it. So if there's certain projects you don't care about, you don't, because that's one of the, I think, issues we had in Stratham. There are two issues. One was bringing commercial uses into the district, which some people got a little concerned about. And the other was like the town kind of telling you what to do, having too much of a say in that. So that's why we exempted a lot of projects. So we just said you don't have to go through the process. If it's a small change or you're putting addition on the back of your house, we don't care about that. So the nice thing about this is you can write that language however flexible you want it to be, or however restrictive you want it to be. You can write it to tailor it that way.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark.
No problem.
Oh, sorry. I was talking and my mic was mute. I was like, come on, Katie, be a professional, unmute yourself. Thank you, Tony. I did put you back as attendee. But we do have a question in the chat for Roger. So the question is there a similar organization that provides campstead easements for Lake Winnisquam, specifically Laconia, to your knowledge?
I don't, but I think it's worth talking with your land trust. The Lakes Region Conservation Trust certainly services that area. I'm not sure who else would in the Winnisquam, whether it's the Belmont or which end of Winnisquam. But it's worthwhile to start the conversation. The National Register process can run independently. So, that's one way of getting the story told. And the campstead easements are tricky. And we took, I guess, somewhat of a risk, but it made a lot of sense in the Squam community. I know a number of other lake communities have had an interest in campstead easements, but haven't yet taken the plunge. And I should say that of the 6 properties, which have all been on record for over 10 years now, we've had no issues with any of them. All the landowners are totally bought into, and we make an effort to bring the next generation of landowners and make them aware of the restrictions and the relationship that we have with the landowners.
Okay, so we do have another hand up. So Carol, you should be able to unmute yourself now and ask your question. And the mic button should be in your ribbon, depending on what screen you're looking at. It will either be at the top of your screen or the bottom of the screen. It looks like a little microphone. If you click it, you can unmute yourself. Okay, well, I think we'll let Carol figure that out. We do have another, oh, her mic is not unmuting. Unfortunately, I don't have anything else I can do to help you right now, Carol. I'll give you a second. We did get another question. Oh, no, that was just an answer from Andrew. Thank you, Andrew, for putting that in there. Does anybody else have any other questions? We got about 16 minutes left of this session, so we can take them. We can give it a second, see if anybody thinks of anything. Carol, if you want to type your question into the chat, we can answer it that way since your mic's not working. Oh, I see Tony has his hand up. So I'll unmute. Okay, Tony, you can unmute and ask your next question.
Yeah. Katie, question for you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So
I'll try my best.
I know you had mentioned earlier about grant opportunities for historic districts. So is there a grant opportunity for, say, like having a Heritage Commission or a subcommittee like the Heritage District Committee to get together and help like rewrite some of the zoning?
Okay, so I don't think I'm the right person to answer that. I'm not familiar. I don't work with these types of projects on a day-to-day basis. But I can I don't know if anybody else.
I'm sorry,
I don't know
it wasn't
if
you, Katie.
Andy,
Maybe
if
was...
Andrew or Brandy is still on here, and you want to, if you want to also raise your hand if you have an answer to this. But yeah, I'm sorry. Unfortunately, Andrew said he can answer it, so let me allow Andrew. You can unmute and answer yourself.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you for answering and stepping in.
Yeah, I don't know all the specifics about this, but there is a fair amount of money coming through. I think its origins are through ARPA, the federal stimulus money. So Plan New Hampshire has Invest New Hampshire Municipal Planning and Zoning grants, which might be able to explore topics like this. So I would go to Plan New Hampshire's website and look for their municipal planning and zoning grants.
Thank you, Andrew.
Okay, so Carol did put her question in the chat. So her question is, congrats to Stratum. How could the historic neighborhood overlay work with the village district zoning, which our town has? Our planning board has commented preservation and conservation are colliding with progress.
So there's a couple ways you could approach it if you already kind of have a village district zoning district in place. You could just kind of revise that zoning, sort of revises the village zoning and make that a village heritage district. Or you could create an overlay. So if you want to look at not just your heritage district, but maybe an area that's adjacent to the historic district you want to capture as well, you can kind of position that overlay however you want to geographically apply in town. And as I said, if you were interested in the heritage district designation, that would have to be a zoning amendment. And I'm happy to share with you offline the language that Stratum has, if that's helpful. But in Stratum, we have a town center zoning district. This actually is not the town center, so it's just north of the town center. So it's a totally different geographic area that we're looking at. So the easiest thing for us to do was just to create a separate zoning district, which is what we did.
Mm-hmm. Great. I see Andrew was following up in the chat as well. Any other questions? We'll give it another minute or so and see if any pop up. I know Andrew is going back and forth in the chat, which is a great place to do that. So thank you. Okay, not seeing any other questions. Okay, I think he's going back with her still. So if everybody else has no more questions, I'm happy to end the session just a couple minutes early before the break. If we can stay on here in case anything else comes up. It's up to our presenters and then attendees as well. So as I'm not seeing anything. Okay. I think I'm going to end the session. I mean, the chat will keep going through the entirety of the conference today, so feel free to, for those having conversations in there to continue that. Thank you, Mark and Roger. We really appreciate you being here and taking time out of your Saturday to speak with us all. It's been really interesting. So at this point, I'm gonna end this session. We'll just start our break a little early. Our next session will start at 2:15, so you get an extra 10 minutes on your break. And for those who are coming to session number 4 of the day, I'll see you then. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.